Hello there and welcome to another episode of the Games Monster podcast. My name is David Pustansky and once again this is going to be an exciting episode. So the main focus of today's episode is going to be the Donkey Kong series, the Donkey Kong Country series to be more specifically, and this is going to be a series of games which I'll probably revisit again in the future. I just wanted to get this episode done. I was excited to talk about Donkey Kong Country. If you've listened to the previous couple of episodes, you know that this was something that I wanted to speak about previously, and now I'm doing it. It's quite late, it's 1:45 a.m, but I decided that I wanted to get this episode out there, and so I'm just going to sit and talk about Donkey Kong Country for a while. Just before we get to that though, I will just say a few little things so that you can find out all of what's going on with the Games Monster podcast. Of course, if you haven't heard the announcement, this is part of the Extreme Improv podcast network. So there's lots and lots of podcasts out there you can also enjoy from Extreme Improv. So if you're into improv specifically, then check out any of the Extreme Improv podcasts. There's the Radio Rumble comedy show. There's the Skill Show where it talks about how to do improv. And of course there's Extreme Improv Book Club, which will be launching very soon, where I'm going to read some classic books with a lot of comedy involved. There's the Super Kick Mania Pro Wrestling podcast, speaking about all things pro wrestling. And of course there's the Mega Movie podcast. All of these and more can be found at the Extreme Improv Facebook page, Extreme Improv on Twitter, and of course the website www.extremeimprov.co.uk. So now that's all out of the way, let's talk about Donkey Kong Country. I'm going to share a little bit of my memories about how I first played Donkey Kong Country. The year was 1994 when it came out, and if I remember correct, I may have played it at the very end of 1994, or if not, I played it in 1995. And the interesting story there is I ended up in hospital. The reasons, it's a long-winded thing, it doesn't particularly matter, but I ended up in hospital, and there was a Super Nintendo that they'd let the kids in hospital play, because I was about 9 years old at the time. And one of the games on there was Donkey Kong Country, and to me it was the most spectacular looking game I think I'd ever seen at that time. And I played it, and I remember one time, and I'll just share this personal story, like a nurse came over, wanted to give me an injection or medicine or whatever, painkillers, and she actually just like removed the console away from me, and I was so upset. I was like in tears, calling for my mum, and it's because the game was being messed up. But anyway, we didn't have a Super Nintendo in my family at that time, but a few months later we got one, but we didn't get Donkey Kong Country to begin with. We got Super Mario All-Stars, which was great, and maybe a WWF wrestling game. And then my sister, a few months later, we went to a Toys R Us and she got Donkey Kong Country. And because she had got Donkey Kong Country, it was her game. And later on, she got Donkey Kong Country 2, did his Conquest for Christmas. And that was actually in 1996 that she got that, for Christmas 96. And within a few weeks after Christmas, I went and bought Donkey Kong Country 3, and I saved up all my money to get it. But anyway, that's the story of how I first played Donkey Kong Country. So, I'm sure a lot of people already know this, but I always enjoy just hearing some facts and trivia about games, even if I've heard it a dozen times already before, just because it's fun. So Donkey Kong Country was created by Rareware, made in the UK, and obviously if you're listening to this, you may notice that I'm also from the UK, and I can say that even if I don't have like super loyalty to everything being UK, and I may watch the World Cup and cheer on England and stuff like this, but for me, Donkey Kong Country being a UK game at the time meant a lot to me. It meant a lot because it had the British style of humour. It had silly, self-deprecating humour. It broke the fourth wall, and it was just the greatest style of humour in a game. Other funny games included things like Monkey Island and Simon the Sorcerer, but Donkey Kong Country, where you'd get the instruction booklets, and there'd be Cranky Kong like narrating his way through the instruction booklet, and it was really funny. But anyway, for those of you who don't know, like, the trivia, the game was created by Rareware. They'd bought the Silicon Graphics workstations, which were incredibly expensive, and were the same kind of workstations that were used to create the CGI graphics for the Terminator 2 film, for Jurassic Park, for The Abyss, and it was like cutting edge technology. And they may have used some of these graphics on a Battletoads game just for one or two assets. But then they discovered, whilst trying to create a game, I think targeting for the Nintendo 64, that what if we just dumbed down these graphics a little bit more? Would they work on the Super Nintendo? And lo and behold, they did. And I think only when you see the end credits of Donkey Kong Country, not that many people worked on it. But the game came out, and when they first showed it off, people thought it was an N64 game, and people were floored when they realised this was a Super Nintendo game. And to me, that's a big part of the magic of when you have these video game trade shows, where people see something new and it's like, oh my god, the reaction to that. Like 25 years later, people can still talk about Donkey Kong Country was shown off, and people thought it was for a 64-bit machine, but it was a 16-bit machine, and there was no way the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive could produce similar graphics. And people were then saying, well, this delayed the N64, whilst they tried to think, well, if this is what can be done on the Super Nintendo, the N64 needs to be even better, and this looks better than some things you got on the Sega Saturn or Sony PlayStation, which was true. When you look at the competition, because the Sega Saturn and PS1 came out the same year, and especially nowadays, if you look back at some of the games that came out on the PS1, the 3D games, they don't hold up. Whereas Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, a 2D game, completely holds up. The graphics of it are still very impressive. Whereas the early 3D games... Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm so tired, I'm just rambling on. But the early 3D games don't hold up. If you look at the game Bug or Clockwork Knight on the Sega Saturn, they're 2D games, and I'd say arguably they don't look as good as Donkey Kong Country. And when you look at 3D games like 3D Lemmings, to me, 3D Lemmings just looked awful at the time compared to the 2D Lemmings games. It was terrible to control. And I always wanted them to get the graphics of Donkey Kong Country and have it be that good in 3D, and I don't think they've ever quite achieved that yet. So obviously Donkey Kong 64, which we'll get onto later, the graphics of that were good, but not as good as Donkey Kong Country. And then when you get the new Donkey Kong Country games, the game Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii certainly didn't have as good graphics. In certain ways, obviously, it may be better or may have more fluid animation or this or that, but just the detail wasn't there. And Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, you could say it's pretty much there, but to me, still not quite. But anyway, before Donkey Kong Country had come out, there'd just been Donkey Kong, the original arcade game where you play as Jumpman, who would later be rechristened as Mario. And then there was Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3. But Donkey Kong Jr. obviously had Donkey Kong Jr. as the character, as the hero, rescuing Donkey Kong from Mario in a bit of a role reversal, whereas in the original Donkey Kong game, Donkey Kong was the villain. Donkey Kong 3 once again casts the Great Ape as a villain. So for Donkey Kong Country to place him as the hero was quite a change, especially, in fact, the one game I haven't mentioned was that Donkey Kong 94, as it's now known, was released the same year on the Game Boy. So there was the game which now starred Mario with Donkey Kong and however many 100 levels or whatever, with Donkey Kong as the villain again. And he had a completely different design to what they would then put into the Super Nintendo game. I think Donkey Kong 94 may have given him a tie, and then Donkey Kong Country also gave Donkey Kong a tie. And the interesting thing, if you don't know the trivia, is that the design of Donkey Kong is basically a Battletoad, which is another Rareware game. And they kind of make his head like a pineapple on a combined with a Battletoad shaped head, eyeballs, shaped mouth, and everything. So there's an interesting piece of trivia for you. And so they redesigned Donkey Kong. The sidekick, which is Diddy Kong, was always meant to be Donkey Kong Jr., but they didn't like the redesign, so they had to make him a new character, so they just renamed him from Donkey Kong Jr. into being Diddy Kong. And it's a shame when you think all of these years later, they've never reintroduced Donkey Kong Jr. into the Donkey Kong Country series. You have had Donkey Kong Jr. appear in Mario Tennis or Mario Golf, or I don't think he's ever been in Mario Kart again, even though he was the original playable character in the Super Mario Kart game on the Super Nintendo. It was only on the N64 that they introduced Donkey Kong as the playable character instead of Donkey Kong Jr. But Donkey Kong Jr. really has never come back into the limelight, and he could have done. And obviously, when we get to Donkey Kong Country 3, they introduce Kiddy Kong, who is basically Donkey Kong Jr., but once again, he's not called Donkey Kong Jr. He's got a different costume. Instead of him just being in I think he's in a diaper, Donkey Kong Jr. that is, and then like a top, like a t-shirt, he's in like a baby onesie kind of thing, and that's Kiddy Kong. But anyway, let's come back to Donkey Kong Country, the original game. So the story of it is that King K. Rool or King K. Rool, because he's cruel, has stolen Donkey Kong's banana hoard for reasons that you don't need to know, but you could just assume that he's trying to upset Donkey Kong, probably lure Donkey Kong to chase after him, get away from his Donkey Kong's environment, and then he'll probably kill him. That's probably the dark side of why he's actually stolen his banana hoard. And so Donkey Kong sets off with Diddy Kong to get his banana hoard back. And that is the whole story. Then there are the extended Kong family, so obviously they'd taken out Donkey Kong Jr., but they've now introduced Diddy Kong, the sidekick, who is clearly a monkey and not a gorilla, whereas Donkey Kong is a gorilla. And then they introduced Cranky Kong, who they put over as being the original Donkey Kong from the arcade game. This is one of the things where they break the fourth wall, because Cranky Kong acknowledges that in the past he could do this on one life or one credit or whatever, and that he's just an older version of the Donkey Kong character from the original Donkey Kong game. Why he's aged so much in about the 10 or 11 years, because I think Donkey Kong, the arcade game, came out in 1983, it may have been 81, and then 1994, so over 11, 12, 13 years later, he's suddenly frail, he's got a big white beard, he's old, you can't even really see how he once was Donkey Kong. And they put over at various times that either he is the grandfather of Donkey Kong, of the Donkey Kong you play as in Donkey Kong Country, or he is the father of Donkey Kong. Now, if he is the grandfather, then there is a missing link in the Kong family. You never see who Donkey Kong Country's Donkey Kong's dad is. But later on, I think they say he's his father. They just filled in that gap. And then, of course, there's Candy Kong, who is a bit like Jessica Rabbit, in that she's just this hot and sexy, long-legged, leggy character who's got, like, I think I'm not incorrect to say, yeah, she's wearing like a swimsuit with like big bosoms, and it's weird to think that that's how they designed her, especially when you see later games that Dixie Kong is basically like Diddy Kong. Does she have a tail though? I can't honestly remember. And then later on there's Tiny Kong, who in a later game in the Diddy Kong Racing DS game for the Nintendo DS, she's suddenly tall when she was tiny and smaller than she was meant to be the younger sister of Dixie Kong. But anyway, I digress. They made this extended Kong family with also there being Funky Kong, who looks exactly like Donkey Kong, but they've given him like a bandana and sunglasses, and he's like the cool guy that lets you use vehicles when you need to jump between worlds. And is that it? Yeah, there's also Manky Kong, who is a villain, and he's an orangutan. And what's interesting is later in the Donkey Kong 64 game, they would introduce Lanky Kong, which obviously rhymes with Manky Kong, and Lanky Kong is also an orangutan. So between the Kong family being gorillas, monkeys, and orangutans, who's to say that Manky Kong isn't an actual member of the Kong family in some way? Because it would seem that you can have various types of monkey and ape involved, or within that family. And then the other bad guys that you come up against are the Kremlins, as well as King K. Rool, who is the leader. You come up against, I'm trying to remember, like they're called, everything begins with K, like Crusher and Claptrap, and I'm trying to remember what other ones there are. I can't remember now. But then, as well as the Kremlins, which are like big lizards, then you get like armadillos and little armadillos, and you get zingers, which are like wasps, and then you get the bosses, which are like the big armadillo and the big wasp, and then you get the neckies, which are vultures, which have got like long necks, and then you get like Master Necky, which is just like a big, like a ginormous necky vulture, but you just see his head. And you go through the world, and it's interesting just how much this is based. This is a game that's just a pleasure to play, because you run through the world and you're constantly running, and it's got lots of elements of exploration, but you can completely speedrun this game. I think the quickest I've ever completed Donkey Kong Country is in just over an hour, and I definitely couldn't achieve that today. It's not the easiest game at times, but when you really remember everything, then you can really whip through it. And some of the early levels I can go back to. I play Donkey Kong Country every single year. I've played Donkey Kong Country probably every year since 1995, at least once. And what's great, and this is one of my loves about some of these older games, is that you can start playing it in a day and complete it in a day, or complete it in a couple of days, in a couple of sittings, or complete it the next day. It's also a great kind of game, so that it's like comfort food. You could be watching an old film, a film that you've seen a dozen times that you don't need to pay super close attention to, and whilst you're watching it, it's great just to play Donkey Kong Country, especially if you're playing it on a portable machine such as a 3DS, or if you've got the gamepad of the Nintendo Wii U, then you can just sit there, or you can play it on the Game Boy Color, of course, or you could play the versions that came out on the Game Boy Advance. It's not available to play on the Nintendo Switch yet, but I'm expecting that it probably will be, probably at some point this year in 2020. And you have like my least favourite kind of levels on Donkey Kong Country are the underwater levels, because to me they're always a bit slow, and generally just in games in general, any games which has an underwater level, the underwater levels are usually my least favourite, just because you have to deal with a character often drowning. Now, not in Donkey Kong Country, but if you play Sonic the Hedgehog or certain Mario games, not all of them, then suddenly air is an issue, and you're constantly having to swim back to the surface or find bubbles of air like on Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's a bit of a pain. Donkey Kong Country doesn't have that aspect, but it controls differently than every other level, because you have to continually tap the jump button just to make him continue to swim, and then to make him swim downwards you just have to like sort of let him float down, and you can press the down button just to try and make him swim downwards a little bit faster, but it's not it's not the same kind of gameplay as the rest of the game, and I never enjoyed them as much because it's not like you can also get flying in games where you can go anywhere, but swimming in games where you go up and down and things can come at you from any direction. You don't get to do it enough so that you get really great at it, because you only get 1 or 2 swimming levels per world, if that. And then, of course, you get the animal buddies. So in the swimming level, something that makes that a lot more fun is when you find Engard the sword. Engard, I say, Engard. When I was younger, I always read it as Engard because I didn't know the word. It's a French word for, like, if you're going to have a sword fight. Engard. I remember this old Tom and Jerry cartoon where it was like based around the Three Musketeers, and there was like the little grey mouse Nibbles. It'd be like, "En garde, pussycat." And I didn't realise that En garde was the same as Engard, so I always just read the fish's name as Engard, but it's En garde because he's a swordfish. And when you've got En garde, you can swim in any direction, you can press a button to kill bad guys, you can swim into bad guys and not take harm, and it makes it a lot more fun. In the non-swimming levels, you get Rambi the Rhino, who's probably the most famous and iconic of the buddies that Donkey Kong has in any of his games. And to the point that I think he's the only animal buddy that comes back in the Donkey Kong Country games on the Wii and Wii U and Switch. I think that's correct, but I might be forgetting something. And he can just, like, again, like En garde, he can run into bad guys and kill them with his horn, just like En garde has a sword for a nose. Rambi the Rhino has a horn which he can kill baddies with. And who else do you have on Donkey Kong Country 1? You have Squawks, who just holds a light for you so that you can see where you're going in, I think, just one level. But then in Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, he can actually pick you up and fly with you and shoot eggs, and he's one of the better animal buddies in the whole series. Then, of course, you have Winky the Frog, who can jump really high, and he has like an interesting rhythm as he just hops along. And then you have the ostrich. What's the ostrich's name? I forget off the top of my head. It'll come back to me. Espresso. There you go. And he's wearing sneakers, a little bit similar to Sonic the Hedgehog. Can run fast and has limited ability just to fly, a little bit like how Princess Peach might float a little bit in the Mario games. And I'd love that they'd always have these golden trophies that you could get of your animal buddies, and when you get 3 of them across however many levels it takes to get 3 of them, it would send you to like a bonus level where you'd have to pick up hundreds of these golden statues of the animal buddy, and you'd try and find the secret +2 area, which would double the amount of trophies you've got, and then for every 100 trophies you've got, it'll give you an extra life. And so if you're a bit low on lives, I'd always go back to like the first world, first level, end up with like 3 Rambi trophies or Espresso trophies, whichever you got on the first world, and then just like stockpile 10 lives, 20 lives, 30 lives just by repeating the first level or 2 over and over again. And the first few levels are all like jungle based. Like the first level on Donkey Kong Country is just such a joy to play. It's so easy. In a sense, it's a shame that the games have these continually more challenging levels and difficulty progression, because sometimes the early levels, just like Green Hill Zone on the first Sonic the Hedgehog, or just like the early like World 1-1 on Super Mario Brothers, sometimes just like the first level being so easy, it's just fun just to come back to it years later and just breeze through it. But then quickly these games, the next levels, level 2, 3, 4, suddenly get quite a bit more challenging. Just gonna have a quick sip. And because they get so much more challenging, if you haven't played it in a while, you might just do the first level and think, oh, this is fun, get to like level 5 or something, and then suddenly it doesn't feel quite as fun and you give up playing again. Sometimes it would just be nice to have a game where you can play it just for an hour and it'd be a breeze to go through. And the early level like 1 and 2 on Donkey Kong Country is certainly, especially the first level, it's just such a breeze to just scoot through really fast. And then after the jungle levels, you start to get like temple-based levels. Like I mentioned before, there's underwater levels. Then you go to different worlds, and you get ones that feel like they're in forests, and you get ones that eventually you get ice-based levels, and then you get ones that are like in a factory, very industrial levels. And the amount of inventiveness in the levels of the Donkey Kong Country series, not just the first one, even though I'm primarily talking about the first one today. I'll talk about the first one again in the future, but I'll speak about all of these games again. I love them so much. But the inventiveness, the amount of things that just come up in one level, or something is in like the first game, and then you get a similar thing in the second game, and then the third game. But like the most famous level type, I suppose, other than the standard and swimming levels in Donkey Kong Country games, are the minecart levels, where it's just that you're in a minecart, and apparently this was inspired by the Indiana Jones minecart chase sequence in one of the movies. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong are in a minecart, and it's just going along, and you can make the minecart jump. I suppose you're making it hop the tracks, and you land on things and jump over the bad guys. And they're really challenging, because I think you get the first one in the second world, or it might be the third world. I think it's the second world, like in the midst of all of like the temple levels. You get this minecart level, and like the last section of it, you get to like there's save points halfway through, save barrels. Everything you get in Donkey Kong Country is contained in a barrel. So to reunite with if you're playing as Diddy Kong, you can have Donkey Kong follow you, and vice versa. If you're playing as Donkey, you can have Diddy follow you. And if you, instead of losing a heart or a piece of energy, you lose one of the Kong buddies, and then you open up a barrel and you'll get them back with you. So you'll have 2 at a time. And then if you get to like a checkpoint, it's represented with a save barrel. And after the save barrel in the first, like, it might be called Minecart Madness or something like this, it just gets really challenging, and there's extra lives and other pickups that you can get, which you have to make precise jumps over, and if not, then you, like the amount of times I spent like 15 lives, 16 lives to complete that minecart level when I first got it, and also when I played it on my new Nintendo 3DS, and I first got to that minecart level, it took me dozens of lives just to learn the timing and be able to get good at it again. And then what else do you have? Like I mentioned, there's one level where Squawks shines a torch so that you can see where you're going, because otherwise it's like blacked out. There's the Stop and Go station, which is quite a famous level from Donkey Kong Country 1, where there are like some certain rock-looking Kremlins that any time they touch you, they will kill you. Donkey Kong is stronger than Diddy Kong, but these are like the most deadly versions of the Kremlins that you come across in the entire game, because if they touch you, you lose that half energy point. And so the way to be able to get past them is you have to hit, again, I think it's barrels or signs of some sort that change from saying stop and go. And so if it says go, these Kremlins are running around. If you hit it, then it will change to saying stop, and they'll like shut their eyes, they'll crumple down, and you can run past them. But it will only stay stopped for a few seconds, and then you have to hit another one of these barrels that say stop, so that you can progress through the level. And that's the only time they have that idea in the entire game. It would have been so easy just on a later level to come to a section where, oh no, there's a stop and go monster here, but it's just on that one level and it never comes up again. Obviously you have a whole world with like ice levels, and you have some with like wind and rain. Now the wind can actually affect the gameplay, because it can like mess up your jumps by making your jumps shorter or making your jumps longer, depending which way the wind is blowing at the time. and I'm not sure if that comes up in more than one level, but it certainly comes up in at least one of the snowy levels. You get like a blizzard, which makes it a bit more difficult to see where you're going, and just loads and loads of inventiveness. The bosses, like, you have to jump on the top of this naughty, actually. I think you get an armadillo, but I was thinking of the naughty thing, which is like a big rodent of some kind. I forget what exactly. And you have to jump on its back and like hit it, I think 3 times, and then you defeat it. Jump on the neck of his head 3 times. And what else? And then, of course, the final boss is King K. Rool. And I've got, just next to where I am sat right now, I've got a King K. Rool amiibo, which eventually they brought out with the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate game on the Nintendo Switch, one of the most requested characters. Yet, shamefully, they've not brought the character back into the series since Donkey Kong Country Returns and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. They need to bring K. Rool back because he is the equivalent of Bowser to Mario. So not having K. Rool in the new game seems a mistake. But you fight K. Rool and you have to defeat him basically 2 boss fights in a row, and it makes it a lot more challenging. You think you've beaten him, and then there's a red herring. And then it turns out you haven't beaten him, and then he has some more challenging attacks. And eventually you complete the game. Now, one thing that's just popped into my mind that I want to speak about, and this is going slightly off topic just of pure Donkey Kong Country, but it's talking about Nintendo and Rareware and their relationship. Because it's an observation I've always had over the years, and I'm sure a lot of other people have made this as well, but I don't actually really remember reading about this anywhere. It's just how Nintendo would have a game, and then Rareware would often take what Nintendo have done and do their version of it, which would oftentimes, in my opinion, include giving it better graphics, giving it more inventive gameplay at times, and just trying to out Nintendo. And straight away people may say, yeah, but what about Perfect Dark and GoldenEye? There was no Nintendo equivalent to those, and yeah, you're right. And there was no Nintendo equivalent to Killer Instinct. You could say that Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter may have been the inspiration for Killer Instinct for its style and genre. But let's have a look at what I do actually mean. So you get Super Mario Brothers, you get Super Mario Brothers, you get Super Mario World if you look at the Super Nintendo, and then you got Donkey Kong Country. They're both 2D platformers. And just as you have Bowser, which is a big dragon monster thing, who is the arch rival of Mario, you have King K. Rool, who is not a dragon, but he's a big lizard reptile thing. So when you look at King K. Rool and Bowser side by side, you can see, yeah, they've followed a similar mould, a similar pattern there. And the gameplay and mechanics obviously have got a lot in common, where it's running and jumping and platforming, and like instead of collecting coins, you're collecting bananas, and you're reaching like the end level checkpoints, and in that sense it's all very similar. Now, that's just a platform game. You could say, well, that's like Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever, but if you take the K. Rool comparison to Bowser, you'll see that there is a connection there. But then let's examine it a little bit further, because obviously you then got Super Mario 64 on the N64, and that was followed by Banjo-Kazooie, which is the closest game on the N64 to being like Super Mario 64. And it added in the ideas of special moves and that you learn along the way. And like Mario had like caps that he could get that would power him up in different ways, but they really added in the idea of you'll learn new moves. And of course you got, after Mario Kart 64, you got Diddy Kong Racing, which basically took the kart racer and it combined it with the idea of the hub world from Mario 64 and collecting, instead of collecting power stars or jiggies like you do on Banjo-Kazooie, you're collecting balloons or whatever. And if you even look further than that, you can see that before they were sold, like, I'm definitely skipping over something here, but before they were sold to Microsoft, you could see that Luigi's Mansion came out, where he's hunting ghosts, where you'd move Luigi's body with the left thumbstick and then move his Poltergust's 2000, 3000, whatever, his way of defeating ghosts with the right stick, like twin stick gameplay. And then on the Xbox, but it originally obviously would have come out for the GameCube, there was Grabbed by the Ghoulies, which was a guy going around a haunted house, much like Luigi was going around a haunted house, and you'd move the character's body with the left stick, and with the right stick you'd do all kinds of fighting moves, but again, it was twin stick. You could look at cameo elements of power and think, okay, so this may have taken elements of Pokemon, it may have taken elements of Zelda, and you can even look then that later in the years, when they're deeply on the Team Microsoft, Nintendo made Wii Sports, and then Rare were put in charge of making not only the avatars, which are the equivalent of the Miis on the Wii, but the Kinect Sports games, which were the Xbox equivalent to Wii Sports. So anyway, I've had that little segue just on saying a little bit more about how Rare have always looked at what Nintendo do and find ways to put their own spin on it, in certain ways do things better. Some people say, well, they don't quite achieve that, but of course every time they are trying to do things better. They're trying to make it the best game they possibly can. But anyway, back to Donkey Kong Country. One of the things which I never realised about the first Donkey Kong Country, it was about, you'd get the percentage of like how much of the game you've completed. I never really understood the idea of the secret rooms, and you have to find every secret room to gain an extra percent. And it took me a long time before I then realised, oh, there's 101% on the game that you can get. I didn't know that was a thing. It was only after Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 came out that you'd get the percentage by finding the secret rooms, and each secret room would have like a Kremlin coin or a DK coin in them, that you'd have to get those coins, which would then up your percentage to be able to complete the game. But because you didn't need to find the secret rooms to be able to complete the game, because they didn't have the concept of like the Kremlin coins in the first Donkey Kong Country game, I just didn't go to a lot of the secret rooms. And I think it's fair to say I have now done a full completion of Donkey Kong Country, even though I think it was only within the last few years, probably when I played it on the new Nintendo 3DS, that I realised that there was a secret room within a secret room on Donkey Kong Country, and how you would ever figure that out without a user guide, I don't know. And when I say user guide, a player's guide, I mean something that tells you how to play the game, which is all you'd have back in the day. You wouldn't have YouTube videos to consult. But yeah, it took me a long time to actually fully see everything that Donkey Kong Country 1 on the Super Nintendo had. I loved these games so much that when it came out on the Game Boy Color, I got it for the Game Boy Color, but I never completed it on the Game Boy Color. I know the Game Boy Color version may have had some extras, but it also, as impressive as it looked, it was really reduced graphics, and not just in quality and colours and detail, but how close you were to the character. So being able to see jumps wasn't as easy, and yeah, I don't think I ever actually completed that one in the end. And then it was re-released on the Game Boy Advance, and I played a bunch of it, but I didn't complete it there. But I did complete it when it was the Super Nintendo game again on the Wii and the Wii U and the new Nintendo 3DS. At some point I'll have to play the Game Boy Advance game again, just because I do have it, and I think there are actually extra levels. I know the graphics have got strange choice of colours and stuff on it, but whatever, it's still a great game. I love this game, and there's many different ways to play it. I'm interested. So that may be bringing us to the end of my very sleepy, and I apologise about that. The tiredness really didn't hit me until after I started talking. I thought I'd get through this better than I did. But this is like almost one of those ASMR things where I'm just like softly speaking about Donkey Kong Country in your ear and yawning occasionally to help lull you to sleep. So sorry about that. But is there anything else I want to talk about with Donkey Kong Country? Other places to play it. I mentioned the Game Boy Advance. I mentioned the other re-releases. I'm definitely going to end up talking about Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, and I probably won't speak about them in the very next episode, just because this series, as I always acknowledge, is going to get better, these podcasts. But I'm just speaking off the top of my head about some of the games I love, some of the video game news as I hear about it. And so one thing I would say, I would love for a new Donkey Kong Country game to be made. I'd love Rare to make it, or Playtonic Games. I've just got Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, which is great, and it plays a lot like a Donkey Kong Country game. And there just needs to be more new games like this. I'd love someone to recommend some indie games or whatever that plays and feels and looks like a Donkey Kong Country game. Not that it plays like a Mario game or it plays like a Castlevania game or something. Something that's like Donkey Kong Country, and I don't know why there aren't more games like it. But what I would really love is a new game in the series, Donkey Kong Country 4, just like they made Sonic the Hedgehog 4, and even though people at first said, hey, this is great, and then later on they were like, nah, this is no good, and then Sonic Mania came out in the exact retro style of the old games and everyone loves it. I would like something to come out in the retro style, but using some modern technologies. So imagine now a new Donkey Kong Country game, call it Donkey Kong Country 4, which is made using like the Silicon Graphics workstations, but the graphics then don't have to be dumbed down, so the amount of detail, and you could have 60 or 120 frames a second. Just imagine if it looked as good as Toy Story 4, but they could almost certainly now do this, where they've got that amount of frames of animation and in like HD and 4K, and it would look this fantastic. And imagine if they had all of the Kongs, so that you don't just have Donkey and Diddy, or Diddy and Dixie, or Dixie and Kiddy, but all of them would appear, just like in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, how you could have Donkey, Diddy, Cranky and Dixie. Imagine if you could have all of them, all following you around, so you sort of had like 4 or 5 hit points. Or even if it was just a remix, so that you could take Dixie Kong into the first game because she got a ponytail and could fly a bit. Just like how you could take Knuckles into the older Sonic the Hedgehog games, like before Sonic and Knuckles, like Sonic 3 or Sonic 2, you could play as Knuckles. Imagine if they just did like an SP version of Donkey Kong Country on the Nintendo Switch, and it allowed you to play as Dixie Kong. There's loads of possibilities, and I think they should definitely do it. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up now because I need to get some sleep. But thank you so much for listening to the Games Monster podcast. Let's just start to bring in some of that edging out music for you there. And here we go. There we are. It's all coming in now. Just starting to wrap things up. And yeah, make sure you check out the Games Monster podcast in the future. We are on all major podcast platforms. This is part of the Extreme Improv podcast network. Look up all of our podcasts from our website, www.extremeimprov.co.uk. We have the Super Kick Mania Pro Wrestling podcast. We have the Mega Movie podcast for movie fans out there. And if you're a comedy fan, and especially if you're an improv fan, do check out any of the Extreme Improv podcasts. It's going to be first episode back after the new year. It is now 2020, and there'll be a lot more regular, so look out for the next episode of the Games Monster podcast very, very soon.